very special guest joining myself and Lowy today, and that's you, John. John Goetz is our friend from over at EnerNEXT, but rather than me talking, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do over there at EnerNEXT and what you guys are up to.
Sure. Okay. So my name's John Goetz. I'm a lawyer at EnerNEXT. EnerNEXT is a legal and advisory firm. So we have a legal firm that works in collaboration with an advisory firm that does business, financial, technical, greenhouse gas compliance type advice. And the law firm does what law firms do, but we do focus on energy and clean technology. And we have a deep expertise in emissions trading and emissions markets. The short answer is yes. It wasn't always looked at that way when I first got into the carbon emissions trading space. Carbon was viewed as a pollutant, CO2 was a pollutant, greenhouse, it was the most prominent greenhouse gas causing global warming, as they called it at the time, and now climate change. And so, no, it wasn't seen as something that had a lot of value until people started looking at it a little bit differently as to what we could use the CO2 for if we were able to capture it and then utilize it. From there, it's graduated quite a bit. Now, as opposed to just sequestering it or using it for EOR, which a lot of environmental groups still are not in favor of, because at the end of the day, it does mean producing more oil. But there are other ways to use CO2, and we've got a number of clients and projects that we're involved in that do that. We have a client called Clean02 that captures CO2 emissions from building heating systems. Runs it through a reactor, produces a carbonate, and then they use that carbonate for consumer products like soap, shampoo, degreasers, fertilizer, all that sort of thing. So that's pretty neat. And I have to admit, I had no idea you could use CO2 to do that sort of stuff, but now that's becoming more prominent. There's other companies that are using CO2 to enhance cement production and sequester the CO2 in cement, and all sorts of cool technologies like that are starting to come to the forefront.
We've always placed a high value on carbon in our world. In that, for example, if you look at the coal business, the oil and gas business, it's all carbon. And we're really just changing how we look at carbon these days. And we understand better today that the impact of these carbon-based emissions, CO2 and others, that we're now trying to do something about it and, let's say, reduce those emissions into the environment. So I think the value of carbon is still there. And, in the process of finding ways to reduce those emissions, just John's point, there's some really neat solutions being developed. Looking at ways to get there, and that's really where the fun stuff is happening.
So carbon markets are sort of a way to facilitate the trading of carbon credits. And before we can understand markets, I'll just sort of say give a definition of a carbon credit, because a lot of people don't quite understand that concept. Carbon credit basically is an instrument that is equivalent to 1 ton of CO2 or CO2 equivalent. And it can be a compliance instrument, or it can be a monetary instrument, but basically it can also be an allowance that's issued by a regulatory authority that allows you to emit 1 ton of CO2 or CO2 equivalent to comply with a cap and trade scheme, for instance. Carbon credits are generated usually when there's an activity that reduces greenhouse gas emissions. So for instance, if you have a company capturing CO2 and sequestering it underground, the emissions that they capture and sequester get quantified, and they add them up and they become carbon credits. And then carbon markets are basically like any other market. They're there to facilitate the purchase and sale of carbon credits. So they call it trading, but really it's just buying and selling. And the participants are either emitters that need to find credits to offset their emissions at their facilities, or they're sellers that have been operating an emission reduction project or using technology that reduces emissions at their facilities, and they have extra carbon credits, and so they'll look to sell them to parties that need them.
This system, let's say, helps enable new technologies to come to life.
Mm-hmm.
And we wouldn't otherwise see that. So that's quite remarkable and really quite a neat feature of the whole system.
Yeah, it is. And we've witnessed and lived that, where technologies are being deployed just because there's carbon credits being generated by the implementation of those technologies. And if the carbon credits weren't there, the technology wouldn't be there.
It's that whole idea of is there value in carbon, and looking for ways to do that. And, as John has talked about, in some cases, there's regulatory markets. In other cases, there's corporations' ESG commitments that they're trying to fulfill. And, I think, for anybody that's working in the technology development field, understanding that is really important in order to be successful. So where do you fit into that, and how do you generate value with the enterprise that you're trying to develop? And so I think, having that kind of background of understanding the offset markets, the credit markets, how to leverage this advantage that you're creating. And the advantage, I should define that a little bit more by saying the advantage of reduced emissions that you're creating. How do you leverage that to help finance what you're actually trying to do? And that to me is, I think, a really important part of this entire environment.
Are there examples of companies, or maybe not companies, could be industries, that are best using this carbon emission trading?
Utilities are particularly good at it, and they kind of have to be, because in a lot of cases, for instance, coal-fired power plants, and as I say, there aren't that many of them left, but to install emission reduction systems on coal-fired power plants is currently economically completely unviable. The parasitic load of the capture system will take 25% of the plant's power out, and that pretty much kills your economics. We've tried here in Alberta. They've done it in Saskatchewan at the Boundary Dam project that Sask Power did. It cost $1 billion, and it's by no means economical yet. Hopefully someday it will be, because again, a lot of these pipelines and electrical utilities, et cetera, can only do so much with the current technology that's available to reduce their emissions, but they're still being required to reduce their emissions. They've had no choice but to go to the credit markets and buy credits to offset their emissions to reach their targets. So they're really good at it. There was an article a couple of weekends ago in the Globe and Mail talking about the top 5 carbon capture and utilization companies in Canada to watch, and 3 out of the 5 of them were from Calgary, which makes sense because we're also the largest emitting province. We've got a lot of engineers like Lowy that have a lot of great ways to say, okay, well, we've got an emissions intense industry here. How do we solve that problem? And the same minds that solved how to get the stuff out of the ground and process it efficiently and economically are now the minds that are working on how do we reduce the emissions from it and how do we make it burn cleaner and all those sorts of things. So this is about the most exciting time I've ever seen in the clean tech and emission space.
The energy efficiency is a word most commonly heard around Solex's hallways, or virtual hallways, given what's been going on lately. So I'm going to put this question to you, and then John, you can pitch in after. But I guess the question I have is, how do carbon markets intersect with industry's pursuit of this holy grail of improved energy efficiency?
Part of it comes down to the whole idea of, what are your emission limits today with respect to greenhouse gases and such? And what are the ways that you can go about reducing those emissions? And certainly burning fossil fuels, that's primarily where energy comes from today. So if you can reduce the burning of fossil fuels, you can reduce your emissions. How does that impact on the markets? Well, if somebody figures out how to reduce their energy efficiency significantly, they potentially have credits to sell, as John described before. And so, or they can take advantage of it themselves, if you will.
Yeah.
And so, it comes down to, for example, being able to track your improvements and then understanding how to monetize those improvements. And of course, you're going to monetize those improvements by burning less fossil fuels. So most likely your operating costs are less already, but there's also an upside now in terms of having something of value for someone else that hasn't achieved what you've achieved in terms of energy efficiency.
Yeah, I think Lowy's on the right track. I mean, in Alberta, we have, and in a lot of voluntary markets, they have a energy efficiency protocol. So anything that somehow reduces the consumption of fossil fuels to generate energy will often result in a credit. There's always exceptions and some complexities to that. But generally speaking, anytime you're reducing, let's say, consumption of natural gas to either heat a building or a facility or to power a facility, you're going to, in most cases, generate a credit. Yeah, so I think with the number of technologies and even better practices that are coming to the forefront now, you're starting to see people realizing that rather than just considering this to be a waste product, let's utilize it as a resource and build on it.
Let's say, I think on this idea of talking about the value of carbon, I just like to really reflect on the fact that, we've always understood that carbon was important to the world that we've created, the world that we live in today. But what I'm fascinated by what's happening out there is we're really starting to understand it better, and we're really, let's say, paying a lot more attention to it. How important it is. And, it starts from, very simple things like having healthy soils and growing crops. There's so much carbon that's required to do that. And within industry, John and I have spent a lot of time talking about, how carbon plays such a big role in pretty much any industry, no matter what you do. And we're starting to understand where carbon fits into that, and understanding better things to do with carbon than just letting it escape as a CO2 byproduct into the atmosphere, where it really is difficult to extract value out of.
John, it's important to us that we keep the conversation going. So if people are watching this today and they want to keep track of what's going on at EnerNEXT, where would you throw them to?
Sure. Yeah, we have a website that's being upgraded right now, but there's still an existing site there with lots of information on it. You can get it at www.enernext.ca, and it'll show you who all of our lawyers and advisors are, and talk about some of the work that we're doing and some of the clients that we're helping and things like that. So.
And Jamie, I just like to do a little more plug for John and the team at EnerNEXT, and the reason why I want to put a plug in is because it's so important that people understand this particular market, and how it can be so enabling for some of the work that people are trying to do. And so, yeah, just give them a call, understand better what's going on, and it'll just be part of your success going forward.